two caveats. One is we have a transportation committee at 11. We need to be out of here at 5 to 11 to go to that. I tell you that so that if you do have comments, and we got a bunch of y'all, that you be relatively brief. And when I say relatively brief, I'm not trying to restrict you in any way. Say what you want to say, just don't say it 4 times. If you did that, you'd be in the Senate. Just kidding, Senator, just joshing with you. So with that, we are here on, what's the bill number? 3359. And our first, well, let me do this. Is there somebody here now? Major Stankus, let's put him up first. Okay. I'm going to ask Major Stankus to come forward, please. Highway Patrol.
Y'all can use. We have somebody on Zoom, and I understand that they can hear us through the microphone. Sir, if you hear us, will you give us a hand signal, please? Good.
Okay, good.
All right, good. So if you make sure members and guests, please use the microphone. Thank you.
No, okay. Major, how about state your full name for the record, and then we have some questions for you.
Yes, Major Sean Stank.
Major, raised about the legality, illegality, enforcement, non-enforcement of traffic laws concerning these vehicles. You want to tell us what you went back and talked to some folks and did some research? What did you find?
Or the reciprocity. And what we discussed is we believe the intent of that law, reciprocity, is what would allow out-of-state motorists or foreign vehicles to travel through the state without having to have the vehicle registered in South Carolina,
Right.
or would allow them up to the 45 days once they establish residency in this state to operate the vehicle until they were required by statute to register the vehicle here.
Right. And so if someone is, see how we say this, if someone, well, in terms of enforcement, if you see one of these vehicles on the highway, what's the position of the Highway Patrol?
Well, if I could bring General Counsel Gore up.
Absolutely.
Yes, sir. He's done a good bit of research on this.
Okay.
Just ask him to join me.
So we got a lawyer.
Because it's not a, yes, sir.
You know, when you're considering laws, it's pretty good to have a lawyer telling you what's going on. And how about state your full name for the record, please?
Absolutely. I'm Marcus Gore. Thank you. This is my first time. Marcus Gore, General Counsel with the Department of Public Safety.
Okay, Mr. Gore, you understand what we're looking at here
I do.
in terms of the legality, illegality, regulation of these vehicles. What is your research and your position on this?
Well, the difficult thing about UTVs is, in a lot of ways, they're not fish nor fowl. They don't really fit neatly into any of the categories of things we have. It's specifically one of the questions that Major Stankus presented me with that I think y'all were interested in, was this issue about the reciprocity, about bringing these in. And I think that the statute at issue is 56.3.150 that talks about the reciprocity. And what it talks about is that a foreign vehicle of a non-resident that can be operated in this state subject to certain limitations. And I think and again, I don't intend to speak for the will of the legislature, but I think the idea here was this was designed for someone who's passing through the state, temporarily going to be here for vacation or something like that. But if you're going to be here and you're going to domicile here, then we expect you to register your vehicles and have them titled here in South Carolina. And I think the key operative phrase in 56.3.150 is, and I'll read it to you if you don't have it in front of you, but it's a foreign privately owned and operated passenger vehicle of a non-resident, and this is the key, otherwise subject to registration and license as provided by this chapter, may be operated within this state without being registered and licensed. UTVs are not subject to registration and licensing currently under the statute. So a UTV would not be eligible for this reciprocity provision. And I think if it were, what you run into is the sort of odd situation to me of a non-resident actually having greater rights than a citizen of South Carolina. Somebody from North Carolina could bring a UTV into South Carolina, operate it, but a citizen of South Carolina would not be allowed to operate it. I can't imagine that was the intention.
Well, we had testimony at the last subcommittee that, South Carolina residents were going to states like North Carolina, I think one of them told me Minnesota, and registering, their vehicles there and then coming back. Now, these are South Carolina residents.
That's right.
Is that legal or illegal?
Well, the one that I'm familiar with is a person who actually created an LLC in Montana and registered the UTV in Montana and titled the vehicle, the UTV, in the LLC's name, which is a Montana resident, which I think was his way, my guess is would be his way of making a non-resident the owner of the vehicle.
A lot of trouble there.
I'm sorry?
A lot of effort and
A
trouble.
lot of effort there, a lot of trouble. I agree. And I don't know if this person's ever been to Montana or not. Now, the difficulty becomes is that the vehicle is owned by a non-resident. It's owned by an out-of-state company, an out-of-state LLC. And what the action we took there, we were actually fortunate in a lot of ways. Is we were aware, based on our knowledge of the community, that this gentleman was domiciled in South Carolina. We saw him on a regular basis. We knew he lived here.
Right.
I don't know if he'd ever been to Montana or not. So that makes it a little easier in an enforcement capacity. But when you're faced with someone who is just passing through, and maybe they live here, 1 month a year, or maybe they are here a bunch, but we're just not familiar enough with them to know if they are domiciled in South Carolina or not, that presents an extremely difficult enforcement position for the patrol to take.
Absolutely.
And I'll tell you, I don't know there is anything on the books that allows us to completely regulate that type of behavior one way or the other.
So, but what this bill would purport to do is make it legal to operate these vehicles on the highways.
Right.
And we've heard testimony from folks that manufacture them, from law enforcement, from truckers, from insurance, from everybody else. They think that's a bad idea. I'm trying to figure out if we need to make it more restrictive to deal with the situations you're talking about. In other words, if we don't want them to operate on the highways. But that's probably an issue for another day.
I understand.
Well, thank you so much for doing
Absolutely.
this research. I apologize.
Oh, sure.
I've ignored Senator Hembry, who is much senior to me, and I've committed a major faux pas here. I apologize.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Gore, I'm looking at 563150.
Yes, sir.
And it seems clear to me. Now, maybe I missed something, but a phrase that you highlighted, otherwise subject to registration and license as provided by this chapter, that is a defining. That's a condition before you can operate these out-of-state vehicles here lawfully. It has to be subject. It seems to me has to be subject to registration and license under the chapter, and these vehicles are not. So wouldn't that, since they are not, this reciprocity? It seems to me it wouldn't apply.
I agree with you.
Oh, okay.
I agree.
All right.
No,
Yeah.
that's absolutely. I agree. I do not think there is reciprocity here for a UTV because I don't think they're subject to registration.
Okay, so from an enforcement standpoint, if I'm a highway patrolman and I'm driving down the road and I see a UTV and I'm aware of that situation, it'd be like, you're not supposed to be on the road and pull them. There's certain I was, quite frankly, this is funny because I was at the meeting here a few weeks ago, and then I was at a cookout of all things on Thursday night out in the country. Out in the country on a dirt road. And UTV came riding by and Highway Patrol came riding by not long after that. And it was sort of like, well, it's an appropriate, use some good common sense is what was going on there. There wasn't any reason that UTV couldn't, legally maybe not, but on this little dirt road out in the middle of nowhere, it's not creating any hazard. And the Highway Patrol is not going to, they're just making a judgment call to, it's not dangerous, use some good common sense. That's what it seemed like to me was going on. And I suspect that happens. I saw it happen. I suspect it happens on a regular basis, but coming down the highway in downtown Columbia, on a secondary highway that has a speed limit of under 55 miles an hour or whatever the proposal is, that's a whole different kettle of fish. So, but from an enforcement standpoint, Highway Patrol would be able to pull that UTV over and say, hey, well, I've got a Minnesota tag. That's irrelevant to me. You don't have reciprocity. Can't operate it here.
I don't disagree with that in principle. The difficulty becomes, I think, though, is that UTVs are not required to be registered in South Carolina currently. And so take, for example, somebody on a skateboard, okay? Somebody on a skateboard, they're not required to be registered either. I think, and I'm not trying to equate skateboards to UTVs as far as their safety or anything, but I think we would all agree somebody skating down I-95 on a skateboard, that's something they shouldn't be doing for any number of reasons. But enforcement-wise, you're not required to register it. We can't say, hey, where's your registration? You're not required to, you aren't a registered vehicle. A UTV falls in that same category. It can't be registered in South Carolina. Now, I don't disagree that they can't take advantage of reciprocity. I think that was my position earlier. But I think the way the statute is structured is that vehicles that are required to be registered that aren't registered can't be operated on the road. The vehicles that aren't required to be registered, that's where the story ends, because we don't know what they can or can't do because they're not required to be registered.
Well, could I follow up the question? So it seems to me, if you've got a vehicle, a UTV, that's riding down, not necessarily the interstate, but some state highway, and the Highway Patrol pulls them over, asks for identification, they pull out a South Carolina driver's license with a South Carolina address indicating they're a South Carolina resident. The UTV has a Minnesota registration on it. Seems to me that the statute indicates, since it can't be registered here, there's no reciprocity. So the Minnesota driver's license tag means nothing, correct?
I would agree with that.
So then you got a UTV operating on and I think this is the point that Senator Henry was making, operating on a state highway illegally, correct? Now,
That's the part I struggle with, is whether that's being operated illegally in the scenario you described.
does it matter whether it has a Minnesota license or not, tag or not then under your?
It doesn't matter for purposes of reciprocity, or it matters, and they don't get the advantage of reciprocity. I would agree with that. What I don't think, I think the position of the UTV operator is, I'm not allowed to register this vehicle in South Carolina. What am I supposed to do?
Well, if you're a South Carolina resident, I mean, the reciprocity applies to people from other states.
Sure.
There is no reciprocity.
I would agree with that. Sure, of course.
Okay, so what you're saying is, I can't register this here. What am I supposed to do? Not drive it on the highway?
I don't think the statute says that. I think that's the whole prohibition. Mm-hmm.
What? There's no prohibition.
Right.
Well, y'all need to arrest somebody for this and litigate it.
It's my understanding that we have
to offer an amendment.
Any volunteers out there to get charged and litigated? I mean, that may be the easiest way to get this done.
It's my understanding that actually we have issued some tickets under this particular provision, and so it may get tested in courts.
What? None of those tickets have been to court. Do you know?
Not that I'm aware of.
So that may be the easiest way to clarify this, because if the statute is in fact, you're correct, and it's unclear, then ambiguity would necessarily, in a criminal statute, go to the defendant. So you might be able to clear this up, and then next year somebody's going to have to propose a statute to regulate UTVs. I mean, does that make sense? In other words, it may very well be legal right now to operate them on highways, is what we're saying, correct?
I don't think any statute speaks to one way or the other, whether illegal or legal to operate on the highways.
So when I say it may be legal to operate them,
I would agree with that.
or may be illegal, the only way, either we pass this statute or a court resolves that ambiguity in the favor of a UTV operator, which would be, an easy way to resolve this, and then somebody could, if they want to, propose a regulatory statute next year.
Right.
or not.
That's possible.
Sort of attractive to me. Okay. Any questions? So we screwed this up enough?
Yeah, probably. I guess that it, and I've kind of looked at the staff, it's sort of for someone who's been here longer than I have, that it feels like the beginning of the great golf cart debate of
Oh, my
how
God.
many years ago. I mean, it's sort of the same, it seems like it's kind of the same thing, as you had this vehicle that was neither fish nor fowl, like mopeds, also back in the, let's see, what year was that? The great moped debate of 2017, 2016, 2017, that you didn't have any, it wasn't defined, so it was sort of this, neither this nor that. And,
Well, I will say this, the statutory definition of motor vehicle, which I don't have in front of me, but is a vehicle that's powered by, under its own power, that it's not, connected to something. I think in that regard, a UTV meets that definition. It is self-powered, it is self-contained. Interestingly, 56350 refers to a passenger vehicle, which is, that's a whole nother term. Is a UTV a passenger vehicle? I don't know the answer to that. They can hold passengers.
Perplexing.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Absolutely.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
for coming. You've confused this even more. What?
you hit the nail on the head.
Yes. Yeah.
Look at all these, it's like all.
Right.